This way, so I can back up a little bit.
Good afternoon. It's really nice to see a full house here. We really are almost at full capacity. For those that are visiting, we welcome you to the Catholic University of America on this warm Tuesday afternoon. We're delighted to have students, faculty, friends, and distinguished guests for the 4th John O. Memorial Lecture held bi-yearly at the Catholic University in honor of the late Dr. John Ki-Chang O. Dr. O served as the Vice President of the Catholic University of America from 1985 to 1989, which today is known as the Provost, and he was a professor in the Department of Politics. The lecture is made possible by generous support from the O family, and we are delighted to have Dr. Bonnie O, who flew in today from Evanston, Illinois, to attend today's lecture. This is in honor of her late husband. President Garvey is also here attending with us, and he'll have a few more words to say. So at this time, let me just introduce President Garvey before I call him up to the podium. So President Garvey is the 15th president of the Catholic University of America. He was the dean of Boston College Law School from 1999 to 2010. In 2008, he also served as the president of the Association of American Law Schools. He has practiced law with the firm Morrison and Forster in San Francisco, and he also taught at the Notre Dame University, his alma mater, University of Michigan, and the University of Kentucky. He received his Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School. He's been married to Jean Walter Garvey since 1975, which many in this room may have seen. Sometimes you see around campus. They have 5 children, 21 grandchildren, and a rescue dog named Gus. So without further ado, I'd like to call President Garvey up to the podium.
Andrew, thanks, and welcome to all of you for this evening's lecture. Let me echo Andrew's words by saying my word of thanks to Bonnie O and to the O family for this gift. Dr. O died in 2010, and he was the provost at this university and also a Bannigan Scholar Professor in the Politics Department, where he serves now. The lectures that are given are in his name address international political and social issues with a particular focus on international politics and the relations in Korea, which were the focus and passion of Dr. O's life work. This year's lecture on the United States and the 2 Koreas is timely as we're awaiting the possibility of another U.S.-North Korea summit. The situation in the Korean Peninsula is of timely interest to Catholics, too. In October, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un sent a message to Pope Francis inviting him to visit Pyongyang. The invitation was relayed through South Korea's President Moon Jae-in, who's a Roman Catholic, during a private audience with the Vatican. There hasn't been a date set, but Pope Francis indicated that he's willing to travel to North Korea. He'll be the first Pope to visit that country, one whose approach to religion, I have to say, that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has said is among the most hostile and repressive in the world. The North Korean regime, the Commission has observed, is known to arrest and torture and imprison and even execute religious believers. Pope Francis has long advocated for reconciliation between the 2 Koreas. In 2014, he traveled to South Korea in the midst of escalating tensions between the North and the South. And in his closing homily, the Holy Father urged forgiveness and dialogue. He quoted Matthew 18, in which Christ tells Peter to forgive his brother as often as 70 times 7. Unless we're prepared to do this, Pope Francis said, how can we honestly pray for peace and reconciliation? The words might not sound particularly politically pragmatic, but they're an important reminder of the human side of politics. Mother Teresa famously said that peace begins with a smile, not with denuclearization and trade embargo. In An era of great political tension, we're proud to honor Dr. Oh's legacy in today's lecture by bringing in two people who demonstrated a commitment to peace and diplomacy through their lives of service and their work in the Republic of Korea. Our speaker this evening, Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, is a former U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea, where she served from 2008 to 11. She was the first woman and the first Korean speaker to hold that position. In her years as a Foreign Service officer, the ambassador has also served in China and India and Yugoslavia, Northern Ireland. She currently serves as the president and CEO of Korea Economic Institute. We're going to extend another special welcome to Minister Jun-Ho Chun, who is the Minister for Public Diplomacy at the Republic of Korea Embassy. He'll also give some brief remarks, but thank you all for coming tonight.
So we are delighted to have Minister Chun Chun-ho from the South Korean Embassy, the Republic of Korea Embassy. And I wanted some representation from the embassy because people don't know, but Dr. Bonnie Oh, who's a scholar in her own right, had co-authored a book with Dr. John Oh about the history of the Republic of Korea Embassy in Washington, D.C. And so I thought it'd be a nice gesture if we could have also someone representing the South Korean Embassy here. But just to give a brief introduction for Minister Chun, he's the Minister of Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy at the Embassy. He began this post in March 16, 2018. Prior to joining the Embassy in Washington, D.C., he was a visiting fellow at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy up in Boston. As a career diplomat, Mr. Chun previously served as the Director General for Bilateral Economic Affairs of Korea. He was also the Deputy Consul General at the Korean Consulate General in Chicago and a Ministry Counselor at the Korea Embassy in Brazil. Other assignments have included postings in Bulgaria and Canada. So I'd like to now welcome up here Minister Chun to just give a few remarks and representing the Korean Embassy here in DC.
Thank you, Professor Lia, for your kind introduction. President Jun-Hyo Gabi of Catholic University of America, Ambassador Kathleen Stephens of KEI, Dr. Tony Wong, and the distinguished guests and the promising students. It is my great honor and pleasure to join the Catholic University in remembering and commemorating the late Dr. John Oh through this fourth memorial lecture series. I'd like to once again highlight Dr. Bonnie Oh and the Oh family for generous and distinct way of remembering a great scholar and the mind of our time. Dr. John Oh, whom many Koreans now know by his Korean name, Ogi Chang. As we remember Dr. Oh, I must say it is very fitting that we have today's lecture on the topic of U.S. and to Korea in the Trump era by Ambassador Stephens. It has been quite an eventful and busy year on the Korean Peninsula as we have observed many news headlines. But for Koreans, 2018 was a historic year. From Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games to 3 Inter-Korean Summit, I don't believe there was a moment in Korean history when we received as much media coverage and as much support. As South and North Korea sought to faithfully implement the Panmunjom Declaration and the follow-up agreements within the framework of international sanctions, families have been reunited, military tensions have been relieved. More importantly, there is more talk of peace than ever before. If we recall the talks of military options, imminent war, this time around last year, this is really sea change. It is true that we have not seen as much progress in denuclearization talks as we had hoped for. But if we call the period from the beginning of the year up until Singapore summit last year, this summer, phase 1, where we confirmed our shared goals at the highest level, we may call the period after that phase 2, where we are trying to come up with ways to faithfully implement the agreement, exchange steps, negotiating details. It seems only natural that this stage takes more time. But the fact is that the train is already on the move and it continues to move forward. Although the speed may not be satisfactory, it is important to note that we have never got this far. The next few months will be critical. Over the past weekend, on November 30th, President Moon met with President Trump on the occasion of a G20 summit in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Our leaders subscribed to the view that the process of denuclearization and settling peace on the Korean Peninsula is progressing in the right direction. They agreed to continue to work closely together based on our ironclad alliance to achieve common goals as early as possible. As President Trump reaffirmed his determination to hold a second U.S.-North Korea summit early next year, we also look forward to Chairman Kim's visit to Korea soon, possibly within this year. One thing I can attest, which I'm sure Ambassador Stephens agree with me, is that we have a special asset that makes all these efforts possible and especially effective. The Korean and the American people and our rock-solid alliance. Just to give you a rough idea, there are more than 3 million Americans who have served in the U.S. forces Korea since the Korean War. The Korean American community has more than 2.5 million people, and Korea sends the third largest number of university students to the United States only after China and India, while almost 1 million Americans are expected to visit Korea this year. And there have been people like John Oh, who has tried to bridge Korea and the United States through promotion of mutual understanding. Author of 6 books and more than 100 articles, Dr. Oh left a meaningful academic legacy on the political history of Korea. Through his latest book, The Quest for Democratization and Economic Development, Dr. Oh searched for universal implication about platforms for democracy. His political philosophy, putting people first, still resonates in Korea when it demonstrated full-fledged democracy through peaceful government transition. On that note, I wish to see more people like him trained and educated here at Catholic University of America to support the Korea-US relations. More minds and insights brought up to tackle the challenging problem like the one on the Korean Peninsula and other world issues. That would be the true legacy that Dr. Oh would like to leave. Once again, thank Dr. Bonnie Oh and the Oh families and the Catholic University of America for inviting me here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Minister Chen. We're delighted to have you here on campus. So now I think this is the moment we've been waiting for, but I'd like to introduce Ambassador Kathleen Stephens. I first met Ambassador Stephens in 2013 in Montana as part of a Young Scholars Policy Network group where Ambassador Stephens served as an advisor. As a junior scholar, you feel slightly intimidated when you meet someone at the rank of ambassador. However, Ambassador Stephens was the most down-to-earth person you can imagine. She actually invited us to a small cabin she has up in the western part of Montana after the formal part of the event was over. I had the privilege of riding in the back seat of her Hyundai SUV, taking in the sights of Big Sky Country. And at her cabin, we got to grill lunch, we went canoeing, we got to listen to her nephew, a wonderful folk singer-songwriter, play some songs from his most recent album. So it's that down-to-earth persona which helped make her one of the most popular US ambassadors to South Korea in recent years, which she served from 2008 to 2011. She was smart, diplomatic, and helped usher in one of the strongest periods of the US-South Korea alliance, including the release of the 2009 United States Republic of Korea Joint Vision Statement, which helped redefine US relations with South Korea. She had this thing called bicycle diplomacy, where she would ride her bike all around the country, meeting Koreans from all walks of life and learning their stories. She was the first woman and first Korean speaker to serve as the US ambassador to South Korea. And that post was something of a homecoming for her, where she served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1970s and then was later assigned as a political officer at the US Embassy in Seoul in the 1980s. As a career diplomat in the State Department, other postings in her portfolio included China, the former Yugoslavia, Portugal, Northern Ireland, and India. Ambassador Stephens also served in a number of policy positions, including acting Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in 2012, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 to 2007, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and then the National Security Council Director for European Affairs at the White House. My goodness, how long is this? There's actually more, but this is truncated. After retiring from the State Department, she became the William J. Perry Distinguished Fellow at Stanford University, and as of this year has taken the helm of the Korean Economic Institute as its president and CEO. Without further ado, please give Ambassador Stephens a warm Catholic University welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, Andrew, thank you so much for that kind introduction. The problem with getting at this point in life, the introductions get longer and longer, but thank you for remembering our time in Montana. I remember with much fondness, too. And thank you to Minister Chun for your kind remarks and your excellent scene setting. We'd probably be better off just going straight to questions and answers because you've done it so well, but I need to, I guess, do my part here, so I'll try to say a few words. I'm also kind of overwhelmed by this crowd. If any more can come in, but maybe that's the fire code. But thank you for a very warm welcome from Catholic University. And President Garvey, such an honor to be here. Such an honor to meet you, to meet so many in your faculty, and most of all, if I may say, your students. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. And I am so honored to give the John O. Memorial Lecture here at the Catholic University this year. This is a series that, as Minister Chan and President Garvey has already mentioned, I think memorializes rightly Professor O's great scholarship and leadership as a thinker and a scholar. I too have read some of his book. I'm still finishing it, Korean Politics, The Quest for Democratization and Economic Development. Now, I was lucky enough to witness a lot of that. I'm seeing a friend of mine for the Peace Corps also witnessed this. You know, we saw on the ground as young people in the 70s, South Korea, a country that when we arrived there in the 70s had a GDP per capita not only less than North Korea, but less than most of the developing countries of the world. And of course, we saw its economic rise. And we saw it coupled, but not in an easy or smooth fashion, with democratization, respect for human rights, taking a place in the world. So Professor Rowe, I could talk you could probably say all day about it. Professor Rowe wrote about this. And even more importantly, in a way, he talked about what lessons can we learn from it that might apply to other places in the world, including, if I may say, to our own country. Because I think what we know is democracy is a process, is a journey, it's not a destination. and the way that you combine ever revitalizing your democracy with the issues of equality, of opportunity, of sustainable economic growth are ones that sees us now in different ways. So I pay tribute to his work and to his looking to Korea, along with Bonnie, who's such an honor for you to meet you, Bonnie, to reflect on that today. But I also do want to say a word about what I know about John Ki-chang-o's life story, because I think it really epitomizes the kind of, if I may say, the drama, the joy, the tragedy of being, of the Korean experience, and if I may say, the Korean American experience in the 20th and 21st centuries. Like so many of his generation, as a young man in newly independent but divided Korea, tragically divided Korea, he saw his hopes and dreams upended by the Korean War. Like so many young men in particular in Seoul, as the North Korean troops swept down and occupied Seoul in 1950, he was almost taken captive, as many were. If he had been, even if life had continued, it would have been a very different life. But instead, he evaded the North Korean occupiers long enough to enlist with South Korean forces, a step that put him on a new, unexpected path, leading eventually to study and a new life in the United States. And I think John O.'s life, along with his great partner Bonnie, life in the United States epitomizes the extraordinary growth and contribution of the Korean American community over the last half century plus. I have to tell you, when we went to Korea in the 70s, there weren't many Korean Americans we knew here. The growth has been extraordinary, and not just in number, but in influence and contribution, adding immeasurably to the great American experiment and experience. And, as Minister Chun said, to the ties between the people of Korea and of the United States. So, Bonnie, thank you so much. This lecture series devoted to Korea honors your beloved husband. Thank you for your contributions to the Korean-American partnership and friendship, and to your partnership over the years. Now, I was told that the only requirement, as Andrew mentioned for my talk, was that it be related to Korea, and that I not talk too long. Because I do want to have a time for a discussion. And my intent was, and it remains mostly, I'll try not to digress too much, to discuss with you the last year or so developments in U.S.-Korea relations, North and South, and where we are now. Thank you, Mr. John, for giving us a good introduction to that. But before I get to that kind of fierce urgency of now, I do have a couple of recollections that I want to share with you, because I think they're relevant to now and to what we're discussing. And the first recollection I want to share with you is I'm reminded of actually by President Garvey's mention that there's talk of the Holy Father, of Pope Francis, being invited to go to North Korea. As was mentioned, I was in South Korea as a political officer in the 1980s. So right around the time that Professor O was the provost here, I was a young diplomat in South Korea, and my beat was to cover domestic politics in South Korea, and in particular, if you like, the opposition. And the opposition, I have to tell you, included a lot of Catholic priests and young people and people in labor unions and people who were fighting for human rights and so on. And the Catholic voices were very important in the debate about how far and how fast South Korea could move from an authoritarian government to a more democratic one. And second, and that's the first thing I want to talk about. And then I'm going to say something, just because of the day we are, about President George H.W. Bush's legacy. And then I'll finally get to what I'm supposed to talk about. But I think you'll agree with it's relevant. So in the 80s, when I was in Korea, two memories. One is, one of my vivid memories, and it was in 1984 when I was in Korea, was when the then Pope John Paul, came to Korea. It's the first time in South Korea such a sort of world figure. I mean, there have been American presidents who come, but had come and had a huge rally. I mean, the South Koreans, honestly, the government was a little bit afraid at that time to have like huge rallies of people. Who would how would that go? But the Holy Father was someone they were very honored to host. It was part of South Korea's coming out in the world, and he came. And although South Korea is not a majority Christian or majority Catholic, everyone came out to see the Pope because of, I think, what Catholicism had represented in Korean history. And in fact, he canonized, remember this, 103 Korean martyrs. And you know, Koreans are always, I hope it's okay at Catholic University to make slightly light of these things, but Koreans always like to be number one in something, like number one in students in the United States, or number one in the class. And at that time they were saying, I think we're number one in the number of Catholic saints from Korea. I'm not sure if that's still true or not, but it's a lot, it's a lot. But it comes from people who were martyred in the 19th century when early Catholicism was brutally suppressed. And it was a time when 19th century Korea, traditional Korea, was struggling to emerge from a very class-ridden society where there was not a sense of equality of rights or human dignity. So this was a very moving experience and a proud experience for all Koreans, I think, regardless of their own beliefs or affiliation. And of course, the Pope's words were diplomatic, you know, but very powerful, very powerful. And even more powerful for me was the fact that I had the chance to meet and learn from the wisdom of Korea's own cardinal, Kim Soo-hwan, whom some of you may have read about. He was Korea's first Korean cardinal. And when American officials, or whether from the U.S. Embassy or congressmen visiting, wanted to come and kind of take the temperature of what's happening in Korea, especially when it comes to things like human rights, the desire to push forward a little bit more against the government, again, which was kind of taking a slow path, shall we say, to democratization, we would go and see the cardinal. And he was a very good measure, I don't say a weather vane, of how people were feeling and how the mood was changing. And I actually, now that I'm back in Washington, I looked at a few reporting tables I wrote. That's what diplomats do sometimes, for those of you interested in the Foreign Service. And we'd go and see the cardinal, and I was the junior note taker, and I'd write these. And there was one when we went in 1985 where the cardinal told the congressman I was accompanying at the time, he said, the people want democratization. The regime has no choice but to listen. And then the comment I wrote at the bottom, as I discussed it when I went back to the embassy, was, you know, it's kind of like the cardinal is saying this now, it's going to happen. And this was a couple of years before, and many arrests and sacrifices and so on, until we saw the decision to have the direct election for president and the release of political prisoners that culminated, and I would call it the first and irreversible step of Korean democratization. So the role the cardinal played is something that always stayed with me and is a great lesson for me. Now, the other thing I just wanted to say, again, is almost like precursors, because I've been thinking a lot about this the last couple of days as we've watched, whether on television or listening or however we get our news, the tributes pouring in, and I think rightly so, to the late George H.W. Bush. You know, there's been so much that, frankly, even though I'm of an age that I can remember him, in fact, I had the chance to meet him a few times, I'd forgotten a lot of this. The Americans with Disabilities Act that was signed by him. Of course, I remember the reunification of Germany and all the things that might have happened, but happened in a better way during his very eventful, although in one-term presidency. And of course, even before he was president, he was a diplomat. Our ambassador at the UN and also our representative in China at a very important time. But nobody's talked about Korea. So I thought, I'm going to talk a little bit about Korea. Because I did have a chance in 2005, again, it's a long time ago for all you students, but it's only yesterday for some of the rest of us. But in 2005, when I was working at the State Department, before I went out as ambassador to Korea, I had a chance to meet President Bush in New York. He was getting an award for his work on Korea, called the Van Fleet Award from an organization called the Korea Society. And so we talked a little bit about Korea then, and I saw, again, he had, friends everywhere. He had a lot of Korean friends. But also, in recent days, I've been looking at the memoirs of two great ambassadors and friends of mine who served, one in Seoul during President Bush's presidency. In fact, he was President Bush's foreign policy advisor, as a sign of how much importance President Bush attached to Korea. He took his one foreign policy advisor from when he was vice president, right, somebody he was very close to, and he made him ambassador in Korea. And that was Donald Gregg. In fact, I just talked to him this morning to tell him I was going to be talking about this. I have his permission. And Ambassador Hyun Hong-ju, who was South Korean ambassador to Washington from 1990 to 1993. And they've written memoirs about this. And I won't go into too much detail. I know I'm not supposed to talk about it, really something really historical, but this was a period when a lot was happening in Korea. I just described to you the 80s when we had a direct election of the president in 1987 with the role of the church, of Cardinal Kim, and so on. So we had this election. The Seoul Olympics happened in 1988. There was a new president who'd been elected. His name was No Tae-woo, and he had been elected in a direct vote. So he had a legitimacy that previous presidents didn't have. And he was trying very hard now, with the aftermath, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to expand South Korea's contacts and horizons. At that time, South Korea did not have relations with China, its neighbor, right? With the Soviet Union, with all the Eastern Bloc. And then in North Korea, you had a country that suddenly felt cut adrift and isolated, with the Soviet Union collapsing and assistance from the Soviet Union sort of evaporating. And with North Korea looking at all these countries, for those of you who studied the history of the end of the Cold War, right, with whether it's Romania or the Czech Republic or Hungary, all breaking off and having these democratic revolutions, if you like, that wasn't something that was really desired in North Korea, so a lot of nervousness about their path. So with all that, what did President Bush do? And these are where I think are the lessons for what we are trying to do. I shouldn't say we, I don't work for the U.S. government anymore, but I have an interest in this relationship. I think what the U.S. and South Korea are trying to do. First of all, President Bush, as the first president, he hosted the first state visit of a South Korean president to Washington since 1953, right? Now, for those of you, again, who've taken a diplomacy course, there's different levels of having a visit, right? Maybe you have that at the university too, right? You can have a kind of a working visit, which is kind of the lowest level, and then you can have a official visit. In the working visit they give you coffee, and an official visit they give you a sandwich at lunch, and a state visit they give you like military parades and a great dinner, but also a lot of substance. So it shows great respect. So the first state visit of a South Korean president was something that President Bush hosted. And secondly, President Bush really stood with and supported South Korea's desire to build a relationship with Russia. He helped to organize a meeting with Mr. Gorbachev, a very unusual thing, hard to imagine now, that a South Korean hadn't met a Russian official. Didn't happen. Chinese, the same way. And importantly, and this is another thing, admission to the United Nations. Now those of you, and I know many of you students who've read something about the Korean War, this was a war that was, if you like, kind of approved by, right, the United Nations, right? This is the United Nations sending troops in to push back the North Koreans. And it ended with the line still drawn and Korea still divided. But neither North Korea nor South Korea, even though their fates, if you like, had been so shaped by the United Nations, they didn't belong. They didn't belong because in the Cold War era, the great powers were kind of deadlocked. President Bush, and I'm not saying it was all him, but he was supportive of saying, let's get the two Koreas into the United Nations. And he made a speech in 1990, and it was the first time any American president had publicly used the official name for North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK. So that was very important for Pyongyang, and it was very important for Seoul. And it helped to set the grounds for where North Korea and South Korea were admitted to the UN, and they're members to this day, without prejudice, as we like to say, to their being someday reunified. So this was very important. And finally, it seems like President Bush, along with his South Korean partners in Seoul and President No Tae-woo, tried for the first time to open a diplomatic track for the U.S. with North Korea, because we weren't really talking North Korea all that time during the Cold War, and also to support South Korea in its desire to open a dialogue. And guess what? One of the big issues, this is way back in the early 90s, was North Korea was trying to get nuclear weapons, and we didn't want them to have them. So, and the North Koreans were saying, well, and this is why, this sounds like today, we want denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There shouldn't be nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And President Bush did something really quite extraordinary, because the United States has traditionally, all these years, still has a policy that's called neither confirm nor deny. Have you ever heard this?
Mm-hmm.
You might say this is something you tell your parents when they come in and ask a question, but what it meant was, of course, the United States is a nuclear power, but it makes no statements to either say confirm or deny, to say yes or no if someone says, do you have nuclear weapons on that ship? Do you have nuclear weapons on that plane? Do you have nuclear weapons, in this case, in South Korea? President Bush said, we have what were called tactical nuclear weapons, I guess it means smaller ones, in South Korea, and we're taking them all out. Because we are committed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and that means no nuclear weapons in South Korea. And President Bush said, and now I'm saying we are taking them out, so there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea, and that continues to this day. And our aim is to have no nuclear weapons in North Korea. It was a very bold thing to do. And the other thing he did, which is also very bold, and it's been done again recently, was he canceled a big military exercise. And it was called Team Spirit at that time. He canceled it for a year to try to build the atmosphere for negotiations. Now, over the years that I've been dealing with the North Korean issue, the exercises is always a big stumbling block. And you'll hear, and I'm sure you always hear, you can never, don't cancel the exercises, and you have to be careful. There's important reasons to have exercises. But he took a bold move to try to build the confidence. And that did help to lay the groundwork for what were some very important North-South agreements that were made in 1991 and 1992. Now, that's sort of the good news. The bad news is what? Look where we are now, right? It didn't solve the problem. That's another issue in diplomacy, right? Or sometimes in politics. You don't always solve the problem. But I think there are a lot of, you can both see that they were dealing with some of the same issues that we are now. North Korea pursuing a nuclear weapons program that is opposed by the rest of the world, not just South Korea and the United States, but the whole world, and is doing it at a tremendous cost to its own people, first and foremost, and also to stability in the neighborhood. But I think that we can see that while the aims that were set out as Seoul and Washington worked together during President Bush's presidency were not met, at least not yet, they do recall President Bush's commitment to the principles that I believe must continue to underpin U.S. policy and efforts on the Korean Peninsula. And Mr. Chun mentioned some of them too, because I think they're shared in Seoul. A strong alliance between Seoul and Washington, denuclearization through diplomacy, and inter-Korean, South and North, reconciliation. The themes are the same. And I think we can learn from the wisdom and diplomacy as we mourn President Bush's passing. So, now I'm finally getting to what my title was, and I have to tell you that Andrew helped me come up with this title of the United States and the two Koreas in the Trump era, because he thought the T word might prompt more interest. So, how many of you are here for the T word? Okay, no hands were raised, I just want to know. But whether it's that or not, seriously, I have found over the last year or so that interest in Korea, in the U.S., within the U.S., the questions I get is more prevalent, higher than I've ever seen before. And part of it's for some of the reasons of crisis we'll talk about. Part of it is because I think Korea's soft power has grown so much. And especially among younger people, I find so many people whose entree, and maybe some of you in this room, I mean through Korean music or Korean drama or whatever it is, have developed a kind of an interest that broadens into other things, which is terrific. I think I came to Korea, through my Peace Corps experience, if you like, because there is something, I have to say, very addictive about this country. It has a fascinating history and culture, and one that in many ways I think pulls in a lot of us. And I know some people in this room have similar stories. So in any event, I don't want to repeat what Minister Chun has already said, but just thinking about, since we said that the Trump era, we're talking about 2017 and 2018, right? And maybe some of you remember all the way back to 2 years ago, November 2016, we had the results of the American election, right? And I think it was the next day that then President-elect Trump went to the Oval Office for kind of a traditional meeting with President Obama. And it was later reported, including by President Trump himself, so I think it's pretty reliable, I guess, that President Obama said to him, your biggest, most challenging, immediate, I'm sure, foreign policy issue is going to be the North Korean nuclear issue. You know, President Obama said, you know, for 8 years I've been trying to deal with it, have not succeeded. They're continuing to grow their nuclear and missile program. That's the most. That's the thing at the top of your inbox that you're going to have to address. And of course, as President Trump took office, we saw in 2017 an enormous acceleration, I would say, and a doubling down in North Korea carrying out tests. Nuclear tests, tests of nuclear devices, and tests of various missile systems. Because, right, if you're going to have a nuclear program, what do you need? I mean, you can say, you have to develop the weapon, and the weapon you develop by having tests. And North Korea had its first test of a nuclear device, which really breaks a barrier, if you like, or crosses a red line, back in 2006, right? Or 6 or 7, I've forgotten now, the first test. And then not so many. And then, of course, we had transition in North Korea from the father to the son, and unclear how that was going to go, but he was consolidating power. So 2017, last year, right, it seemed like every few weeks there was another test. And North Korea was saying, we are out to establish ourselves as a nuclear power. And moreover, and this is something that I think really got attention in the United States, I mean, even more, if it's possible, than the development of nuclear weapons, is North Korea said, we're going to develop missile delivery systems, including intercontinental ones. So from the point of view of the United States, the threat was no longer a very dangerous country with nuclear weapons, which are outlawed by international law, and the threat of exporting that, but also the threat that they could actually deliver that system, deliver a nuclear weapon to the American mainland. So this was, as many of you remember, a very, very big issue in 2017. And how did President Trump respond? Well, with fiery language, right? He did not take the approach he did not take the Teddy Roosevelt approach. What did Teddy Roosevelt say an American president should do? Speak softly, but carry a big stick. He spoke very loudly. And he said, I have a very big stick. And he said, fire and fury will await. You won't know what will happen if they do this again. And tensions got higher and higher and higher. And you'll find people have different views about that. But what I think we can say is that by the end of 2017, both leaders, President Trump in Washington, and generally Washington had been a lot more restrained, I guess, and North Korea were threatening each other. And there was a real concern that either we would get into a military conflict inadvertently or through miscalculation, which in history is often what happens, or intentionally. And I think we know that that President Trump, like his predecessors, was looking to see if there were some military options to address the issue of the possession of nuclear weapons and missiles by North Korea, and found, I think from the advice he was given, as every previous president has found, that the military option, if you like, is a very, very unsatisfactory one, both in terms of being able to get rid of the problem and in terms of being able to avoid a larger war, and a war that would also include South Korea. So it was a very tense time, right, up until the end of 2017, and Minister Chun mentioned that. And then we had at the beginning of the war, and of course we had a new president in South Korea at the beginning of 2018, this sudden opening to diplomacy, which President Moon Jae-in, the new South Korean president, embraced with an invitation to North Korea to participate in the Winter Olympics. And then this was fast followed by the United States joining in support of that, and President Trump saying, maybe the problem has been that we've never really met at the top. And actually, some people had always said that. Now, how can you actually have a diplomacy? Traditional diplomacy is, you start things at the bottom, you work out the problems, and finally you get the meeting at the top. So no, we're not going to do that. So there were summits, which had happened before, but not for a long time, between the South Korean leader and the North Korean leader. But as mentioned, several summits now between President Moon Jae-in and President Kim. and the first ever meeting between an American president and the leader of North Korea, right? In June this year, so just about 6 months ago. So it's been, I would say, a kind of a head-spinning year, at least for those who are used to traditional diplomacy. And you will find opinion quite divided about where we are on the balance sheet of what's come out of that. But I'll try to talk about a few of those. Certainly, much of what's happened, as we mentioned, is very, very welcome. There's been a clear reduction in tensions and a sense of moving back from the precipice of some kind of armed conflict. Very, very welcome. The engagement at the top level, I think, is very welcome. Hopefully that can help to break this Gordian knot. There has been a halt in North Korean testing. They did not test this year, either missile tests or nuclear tests. And they have taken some other steps to shut down some of their nuclear and missile-related facilities. Not complete, they haven't had inspectors in, this has not been the result of a negotiation, but they've taken some steps. On the US and South Korean side, much as in the early 90s, but even more, there's been a suspension of large US and South Korean military exercises that the North Koreans said were so provocative. In fact, I think when President Trump announced he was suspending them, he called them provocative war games, which I imagine is the language he heard from Kim Jong-un in his meeting. But they were suspended in any event, and has contributed, I think, to this sense of lowering of tensions. And there is at least a verbal commitment to a diplomatic solution. I also welcome the fact that the DPRK, North Korea, and Kim Jong-un, its leader in particular, has made it very clear they really want to have economic development, and they are taking some steps in that direction. And of course, the South is looking at a number of projects along the way. But the question, of course, is how does this all fit together? So here's where I think some of the challenges are. The negotiating track, and certainly the negotiating track below the leader level, if you like, has, to put it mildly, been less than robust. Since June, it's been very difficult, I think, especially for the American side, to have the kind of meetings with North Korea they would need to begin to make some progress on the rather general restatement in the Singapore statement when President Trump met with Mr. Kim that North Korea was committed to working toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That's pretty general, right? Very welcome, pretty general. You do need to have more specific, I think, progress along that line. And there are worries that, and you hear these a lot in Washington, you hear, I think, a little bit less in Seoul, but some, about Seoul and Washington staying in step with each other. And I would say about this is always a perennial. You know, we talk about our alliance, but we work on hard things together. And much as in a family, when you work on hard things together, it doesn't mean you always have the same view. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you sometimes don't go in some different directions. But there's worry that Seoul may be so eager to move forward with the inter-Korean reconciliation and confidence building and economic measures that it will lessen the pressure, if you like, on North Korea that I think in Washington, at least in the Trump administration, is felt to be very necessary to persuade it to make the very tough choices on getting rid of its nuclear weapons. And the kind of pressure I'm talking about is of course, primarily the sanctions that remain in place, the economic sanctions that limit other countries' ability to do business or trade or work with North Korea in any economic, commercial, or business areas, and other areas as well. So this whole notion of what is the sequencing here, you know, and again, you can kind of think about it in a very human way, or, you know, how much do you front load a reward to somebody in the hope that they'll, you know, what is confidence building, and to what extent do you keep the pressure on? What's the mix of carrots and sticks, right, to get to where you want to go? And there's also the question of China's role, as we've seen the U.S.-China relation become more fraught in some ways, in a sense that perhaps, and these are all big topics, but you have a lot of people studying deep things here, but to what extent, given perhaps the changing nature of the U.S.-China relationship, I'm not just talking about the trade relationship, but the sense from the Trump administration of seeing China now as as a strategic threat longer term, and you see that in some of their official documents, not just in the tweets. Does that make Korea, as it's been in the past, a place of potential conflict? I'm not saying so much military conflict, but disagreement and competition rather than cooperation. Certainly China and the United States both agree, I think, that the Korean Peninsula, and in this case it means North Korea, shouldn't have nuclear weapons. But there's the broader, if you like, geopolitical context as well, and that may be shifting in ways that makes it more challenging. So a lot to worry about, but at the same time, as we review the year, a lot to welcome, I think. Now, I guess this kind of almost finally, I want to say a word too about specifically U.S.-South Korea relations, aside from the issue of dealing with North Korea together, because sometimes, we get so focused on North Korea that we kind of forget that, and that's why I have alliance in there, that the U.S.-Korea relationship has become broader and deeper over the years. To me, the word alliance does not imply simply a military alliance, and by simply I don't mean small, but it is a broader thing. It's very much based on the kinds of shared values that we've developed over the years, whether it's a commitment to human rights and democracy or our people-to-people ties. But to be frank about it, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you can't see by picking up, your Twitter account or the newspaper every day. We have an American administration now that has expressed skepticism about the value of alliances to the United States. Now, United States alliances have been a foundation of the U.S. Stance in the world since World War II. Whether it's our bilateral alliances or it's our alliances through NATO and Europe, but our alliances obviously in Asia include the Republic of Korea and Japan and elsewhere, Australia and elsewhere. And I think that it's forced everyone to think anew about how do we think about alliances in this era, because President Trump himself has raised those questions. Now, for some of you who've read, some American history, you know that in American history we have our attitudes kind of wax and wane. We turn in for periods, we reach out for periods. We have, clearly things like immigration and other things are kind of roiling the political waters here. But this has an impact on, I think, how we think about alliances. So, and it has expressed itself, I think, in the last couple of years under the Trump administration as freshly questioning, well, why do we have troops in Korea and who pays for them and how much? Now, there's a story to be told there, and I think it's a story that says it's certainly in U.S. interest to have troops in Korea, and in fact, there is very robust sharing of burdens, sharing of the cost of those troops. But that's a little bit of a longer answer. But even those questions being raised, it's very conventional for a while. People didn't raise those questions. Now they've been raised. So that's a healthy thing. That's a healthy thing. And what is it that we do together in addition to worry about North Korea? Many, many things that we can talk about during questions and answers. But in terms of the kinds of global development and health issues, energy issues, actually on Thursday, my organization I work with now is working with the Korean Embassy to talk about some of our initiatives in the economic sphere that have to do with the fourth industrial revolution. I haven't quite figured out what that is, but these kind of changing nature of our economy and these issues that transcend borders. And who do you work with? And South Korea has tremendous human capital, tremendous need to stay engaged in the world, and the U.S. brings certain strengths too. We're natural partners in many areas you might not think about us working together, and we've shown that over recent years, and we'll be doing it more in the future. So that's part of the alliance as well. But there is also the issue of trade. And here I think the story is a pretty good one, and it could have been different. One of the things that I worked on during my time as U.S. Ambassador in Seoul and previously was the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, right? Which is one of a number of free trade agreements. NAFTA is another one, for those right, between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., which was passed earlier. But the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement was the biggest free trade agreement that the U.S. has signed since NAFTA when it was finally implemented in 2012. And it was considered to be a very up-to-date free trade agreement. And we had a president who came in and said, I want to look at it again. So we did. We did. And we came to another agreement. And now it's awaiting final ratification. But it was an unsettling thing, I think, for people to say, we have to look at this again. But I think it's been managed in the context of the alliance, in the context of the work we're doing together, not only on North Korea, but globally. But certainly, we also have to, I think, mention that Korea, as South Korea I'm talking about now, as the country who I believe has the largest trade with China, any country, right? It's always a large, but it's a huge trading relationship, and yet a big relationship with the United States. Gets very worried when the U.S. and China seem like they're about to be in a trade war. So 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, whenever it was, when there was an announcement that President Trump and President Xi over dinner had sorted out the U.S.-China trade issues, a little unclear. The day after, well, the U.S. stock markets went up. The South Korean stock market really went up. It's very, very important to them. And that's another thing I think we as Americans have to keep in mind, is that we naturally think about how this is impacting us and our economy, but the impact it has on a place, an ally like South Korea, is absolutely enormous. But it is another issue where I think that in the 2 years of the Trump administration, the habit of dialogue and cooperation has gotten us through some rough patches, and I hope still will. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here in a minute. I mean, I had 3 other words other than the T word in my speech title, and I think they were denuclearization, alliance, and peace. I want you to think about those as kind of parts of a 3-legged stool, if we're thinking about the U.S. and the Korean Peninsula. And denuclearization is one of those kind of words I don't think I ever used until I got involved in Korean affairs. and it's also one of those words that people, even the definition of is something that people argue about, including, does North Korea really mean by denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula that they're going to get rid of their nuclear weapons? That's a question we can discuss. I don't think anybody really knows. But part of it is defining. But denuclearization also, to me, means what is North Korea's future going to be? And what is our relationship going to be? The U.S. sort of relationship, if you like, or lack of relationship with North Korea has been almost solely around this issue of nuclear weapons, other than the defense of South Korea. And I don't think we're going to solve the nuclear issue until we see it as part of a package of issues. And that package of issues also includes, I'm going to go to the other leg, now it's peace. And what do we mean by peace? Well, you'll find that there's not a lot of agreement on that either. You can get into sort of the terminology of diplomacy. Peace, and you'll find, and I can recite these words in Korean too, and I don't know what they mean in Korean either. I mean, literally, like what people are talking about. A peace treaty. Because, right now, the armistice, 1953, the temporary armistice, is still in place. Do we need to have a treaty to replace it? Probably. If so, when? And under what conditions? And who should sign it? And what would it mean for the eventual reunification of Korea? And what kind of peace process do you need to get there or after that? Because wherever that treaty or agreement is, that's just the beginning of a process. You really do need a process. And what about, very central to peace, is the relationship between the two Koreas. Both Koreas remain committed as government to reunification, eventual reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and certainly the tide and the force of history would tell you, and I believe this, that there will be reunification. But we hope it comes peacefully, a peaceful reunification. But how do you get there? Through what kind of reconciliation process do you need? And are there lessons we can learn from other places about that kind of reconciliation? And what role can the U.S. play, and should the U.S. play? And then finally, alliance. I do believe that the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea has served not only both our countries and our peoples very well for the last 65 years, since it was formed, really out of the Korean War, in the crucible of the Korean War. It served the region very well. It's helped usher in an imperfect peace, but a period of stability that has allowed the extraordinary blossoming of South Korea's economy and its democracy. The rebuilding of Japan, the extraordinary re-rise of China. All of this has been, I think, possible in part because of the kind of stability that and peace that our system of alliances and commitment that the U.S. has made in Northeast Asia has helped to underwrite. That's to take nothing away from the extraordinary accomplishments of, which is first and foremost, of the people themselves. But alliance is important. And the alliance, I believe, with South Korea is, as I said earlier, deeper and more resilient and less brittle than ever because we share values. And I think that's what has gotten us through, quite frankly, some bumpy bits as we've had our political processes. South Korea's had some too. And I think it's what's going to ensure that going forward, we can find a way to match and marry the goals of no nuclear, North Korea without nuclear weapons. I'm saying that instead of denuclearization. But getting rid of the nuclear weapons. Let's try to speak in plain English. And finding a way to reconciliation and greater future for the long-suffering people of North Korea. So thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you, and I'd be happy to have a discussion if we have a little time.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Stephens, for your remarks. So we do have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to pass around the mic. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Just say your name and maybe where you're from, if you're a student here or from elsewhere, and we can take your questions now.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for being here at this university. My name is Dwayne Paul. I'm an undergraduate student here at COA. And my question is, do you think one of the reasons there is a lack of reform in North Korea is because of the cult of personality? If you look at historically other self-described communist states, a lot of it had to do with a cult of personality, whether it was Mao in China or Stalin or Lenin in the Soviet Union. And if you look at them now, you know, well, with the exception of China, but other countries, they're moving away from a cult of personality to more other leadership. Do you think that could be another blockade to reform?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I do. I think that if you look at, North Korea's experience, and of course, North Korea was only North Korea starting, I guess you'd have to say, in 1945 when that, again, temporary line was drawn. But you had a Korean peninsula, an entity, a nation, a country that had, for centuries, and sometimes in very difficult circumstances, retained its identity and its culture and its sense of independence. And then at the end of the Chosun dynasty, the annexation by Japan at a time of great weakness in Korea. And then coming out of the Japanese period, if you like, the Soviet period, right, and the installation of a leader. I'm saying all this, they haven't had a lot of exposure to the notion of building institutions, modern institutions, civil institutions, that do act as a means of broadening the dialogue and allowing change. So yes, I agree with you, but I think we think about the century of North Korea. It really went from, in the Japanese period, of course, where it became harsher and harsher as the years went on. This kind of iron rule of, and then the idea of the Kim family, which I suppose in a way, I'm a little hesitant to say it in front of my Korean friends, they may disagree with, but it's a little bit sort of like a dynastic thing, right? So it's just the idea of total power in one person is ill-suited to the kind of modern world in which we'd like to see North Korea embed itself.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Chang Yan-bang from South Korea, and I'm undergraduate student and exchange student also. So I'd like to ask you that over the past few years we have been through so much like political accomplishments such as Panmunjom Declaration, as you mentioned, and also a GP point, military force retreatment, and also other things. But I think the only thing that guarantees the eternal peace between South Korea and North Korea is irreversible and also testifiable denuclearization that Donald Trump, president, has been insisting on. So how do you think about the probability of denuclearization, and also how do you think And what do you think about like probability under his presidency that we
Yeah.
can come through that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think that the challenge of persuading, pressuring North Korea to peacefully give up its nuclear and missile program, the challenge is much greater now than it was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, simply because they have so many more, right? They've gotten so far. And we were working on this 25 years ago. They didn't even have any then, or maybe it's a little bit. Now they've got quite a bit, and that's what they've said. Kim Jong-un has said, I've got my little arsenal here, and so I think it's a little unclear how, under what circumstances they will give it up. But I think that's the role of diplomacy, and diplomacy means both carrots and sticks, pressure and incentives, to show them a different path. Because I agree with you, and I think there is broad agreement on this, that we will not achieve our other goals of peace and economic development on the Korean Peninsula, including North Korea, as long as North Korea holds on to nuclear weapons, which the international community has said, they should not have. Again, this is the Security Council in many, many resolutions. So I don't know yet. I don't know what's, I can't read Kim Jong-un's mind, and I don't even think we have to think about that right now. We have to get into a process, and I do think it will be a step-by-step process. What I'm a little skeptical about, and I can't quite tell honestly sometimes where the Trump administration is coming from on this. I think they understand it's not. I don't think it's going to happen in one day. And in fact, scientists, nuclear scientists, will say it's. And we saw this actually in the former Soviet Union when we were denuclearizing, if you like, the voluntary of the former Soviet Union. And so, it's complicated. You've got fissile material. You've got really dangerous material. You've got engineers who know how to make these things, right? So. If you want to get to a point where North Korea decides it doesn't need these nuclear weapons anymore, it doesn't need these missiles, it's going to put its resources in something else, it's going to have to be part of a confidence-building process, and it's going to take, I believe, some time. So I don't know, how much time. I do see that the Trump administration has kind of widened at times its timeline, a little bit more than for a while they were saying within a year or so. I'm not a technical expert, but technical experts tell me it would take longer. But there are many things they could do right now. And my worry right now is we haven't started on that road. So we need to get started on that road of negotiated confidence building through actually having inspectors in, having a better idea of what they have, and really sitting down and saying, this is what we need to have to be sure we're moving towards denuclearization, and talking to North Koreans about what they feel they need to have. And it troubles me a bit that process, as far as I know, and I hope there are things going on that I don't know about, and there may well be, that process needs to really get a little further along, and then we can see.
Hi, Nicholas Samusevich,
Yeah.
PhD student here at Catholic University. You talked about the idea of getting things done at the top, and so another idea is that the U.S. and China should just do things, and President Trump has kind of tweeted about this, that the U.S. and China can get things done. So how does the kind of U.S.-Korea alliance and that partnership of getting things done work within the dynamic of the U.S.-China relationship and getting things done? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the point of view of a professional diplomat, and I've worked on both U.S.-China bilateral issues and U.S.-South Korea bilateral issues, there's a big difference in how we're able to communicate with each other. And I think that the strength that the U.S. and South Korea have is that we have, and we use the word institutions again, we've kind of institutionalized over time a variety of dialogues and formats to talk about a whole range of issues. And we've also built relationships so that over time, again, we can, human relationships are important, and I think President Trump emphasizes too, but you need to have that to give continuity and substance to a relationship. It's been actually very difficult to develop that with China, and I'm talking about, prior to the Trump presidency, and that's why you've seen over the years the U.S. and China try to come up with a variety of mechanisms. One was called the SED, right, the Security and Economic Dialogue. We had vice presidents going. It was all to address this issue. But kind of what happened with it, and I think they have to continue, is you would have a meeting, and each side would come in, and of course I think the Americans thought the Chinese were worse about this, with their talking points, and just read their talking points. if you can't move beyond that, it's hard to get things done. So I would just say it's the habit of cooperation, it's the habit of consultation over the years that has, underpins not only the U.S.-South Korea alliance, but the alliance relationships we have with other countries, and that's what we rely on. Now, relationships at the top do make a big difference too. I think President Trump coming into the presidency without any prior government experience, he has really, I think, completely highlighted the role of the top, the summit. And that is a different kind of approach to say, especially with a country like North Korea. Because the other thing, it was kind of standard practice. And again, I'm not saying it was right or wrong. I have my own views, but it kind of used to be, if you like, that meeting the American president was considered to be kind of a reward. I kind of mentioned, the first state dinner for South Korean president since 1953 was after democratization or after democratic election. It was considered a reward. And now we didn't have a state dinner with Kim Jong-un, but the idea that you would start there is a little bit heretical to, in diplomacy. But he did it. And there were some who felt that given the cult of personality in North Korea, that was the only thing to do. Now, I will say, in previous administrations, the Clinton administration was one. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, she went to North Korea and she sat down with Kim Jong-il for about 2 days, talked about missiles. And the idea was eventually for Clinton to go there. And the Clinton administration was very criticized for this, for even sending Madeleine Albright there. But the idea was the same thing. You got to talk to the top guy. So President Trump took this up and put it and did it himself. We'll see, and I think what we're seeing on the China side, so I'm not being too topical here, but we mentioned the dinner, the 2.5-hour dinner where the President Xi and President Trump made some kind of decision about, but made a decision to postpone increased tariffs on goods for a certain period of time. And the immediate reaction, at least if you judge by the stock market, I've never followed the stock market, so whoop, it went way up. Today I just read before coming, it went way down, because now people are saying, what's the agreement about? So I guess what I'd say is, I think you can do a lot at the top, but even if you do it first at the top, you've got to fill in later on, and that's where we are in North Korea too, I think. And is if the leaders can establish some trust, President Trump has said he's in love with Kim Jong-un. Those are not probably words I would have imagined I would have heard, but he has his own way of expressing himself. I got that. And if it builds confidence, that relationship could be important, but I don't think we will get there by itself, that we have to fill in the details. And the details are, frankly, and I hope some of you go into this work, it's grinding work. Even if you have the will there to say, okay, all right, our leaders have decided that, we're going to, presuming, right, that the North Koreans have instructions, okay, get started on a road to getting rid of nuclear weapons, because eventually that's where we want to be, but we want to make sure we get some things in exchange. Think about how complicated that is. And think about how you need, the kind of experts you need in the room, as well as negotiators. Because, if I were the negotiator there, I would need some, or if I was the North Korean too, I'd want someone kind of tell me what's possible. What's possible? And what, from just your point of view of your national security, should you do first? Is it missiles? Is it the fissile material? What is it you want to keep? What are you going to do with the scientists? There's a lot. But there's also a lot of expertise built up, as I said, in trying to do that to reduce risk. But it's not something you can do at the leader level. But you can certainly send the message of what you want to do. And I think it was referred to, if that's powerfully sent, that could be a very, very good thing.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much, Ambassador, for sharing your views. I'm a South Korean student at CUA. My name is Yuna Oh. And as a South Korean, I never met North Korean in my life until only about 3 years ago. And I could feel the tangible change in my country that I live a different world than my parents had ever lived, And it was, I think, a general public who follows the news. I think everyone is a little confused, in fact, because this is such a drastic change from last year, where we talked about the outbreak of a Korean War, and now we talk about very peaceful negotiations. So my question is that we have an increasing number of North Korean refugees in South Korea, and some of them are young students in South Korean universities. And I would like to hear from you that it is undeniable that current Kim's regime did violate international human rights laws. Do you think international community would have certain trials held responsible for all these violations, despite of all these peaceful talks we are having now? And do you think that there is a need for educating young people, not only just South Korean, but also from North Korean side, to educate about how we're gonna build an integrated society between North and South? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, on your last question, absolutely. And I think a conversation, I mean, particularly among Koreans, but about how to build that kind of society is very important, and including those North Koreans who have left North Korea. I think there's about 20,000 or so, maybe more in South Korea now, who have left North Korea and settled, some with greater difficulty than others. It's a very big change, so they're very different societies now, even though they are Korean. I think that's very important, and I think I know that the U.S. government over the years has also tried to support that where we can. I met, when I was ambassador there some years ago, quite a few North Koreans who were trying to make their way in the South. And actually, one of the things they told me, they said they find it very hard. A lot of things are hard in South Korea, but South Korea and Korean language uses so many English words now, and they hadn't learned them, and then they felt like they didn't really know English. I mean, it surprised me. Of all things you could have difficulty with, I was a little surprised at that, but that was one. And so we actually started sending, volunteer tutors from the embassy just to work on English. You know, it could be small things, but I think that's extremely important. I mean, with respect to how you address the clearly just unspeakable suffering, in many ways, of the people of North Korea have endured for decades. It's very hard, right? I think on the one hand, it's important to shine a spotlight on the issues and to be honest. So I welcome the fact that the United Nations for several years has had a special rapporteur for human rights. The U.S. has had a special envoy for human rights for a certain number of years. We don't have one right now, but I hope one will be named. I think the world needs to understand and know, to the extent we can understand it, what the situation is. But I think we also have to be realistic. To what extent is that helping people there right now, and what do we do about that? And I think opinion is divided on that, as to what you can do. I don't have any magic answer. I think we can certainly try to maybe point to some things, and there have been some small examples of this, where perhaps the regime might, which is sensitive, I think, to the opinions from the outside world in some ways, might take some action. For example, they were criticized in previous years for their treatment of people with special needs or disabilities, and they actually took some steps to try to address that. I'm not saying that that is begins to address the totality of the issues, but there's a sensitivity there. So so there's kind of the incrementalist approach, if you like. But you'll also find, frankly, and especially among North Korean refugees and defectors themselves, a sense that until the regime goes, there's no real answer, and we must work for regime change. There's a division of opinion on that. But if the view is to try to achieve something peacefully, then I think that working with the North Koreans who have left and are seeking to figure out a way to live together, that's very important. And I hope, and this is another, I actually hope that we can find a way to continue and expand humanitarian assistance to North Korea. It's a little bit different than human rights, if you like, but humanitarian assistance, because there are huge health needs, maternal and child nutrition needs, and others in North Korea. And I'm speaking personally, I only speak for myself, but I think those are issues that, certainly consistent with longstanding U.S. policy, it's not being followed right now, but longstanding U.S. policy that should be done. I think it's actually, if I can say, I want to say consistent with, I think, what I've seen Catholics do over the years, that should be done as a separate matter to where we get on denuclearization and lifting of sanctions. And once you have some of these humanitarian groups working in there, I think that also helps you to kind of get a better sense of how you might slowly begin to work on some of the broader human rights issues. That's the best I can do on that. It's very challenging.
Okay, we have time for one last question, but I'll just round up. So I see two hands, and we'll just collect these two together, and then we'll wrap up. So.
More questions?
Hi.
Christy.
How are you?
Christy and I were Peace Corps volunteers at the same time in the 70s. Christy lived in Chungcheongnam-do and Onyang, which I think almost no longer exists. Right? And I lived in Yesan. And at that time, from Onyang to Yesan, none of you, I realize, know this, Bonnie, maybe you do, and Chungnam was about a 45-minute bus ride, as I recall. So we we were the closest neighbors of Peace Corps volunteers. Anyway,
Right.
okay.
Anyway, yeah, thanks, Kathy. But I keep thinking, about a year ago during the Fire and Fury era, that, Gaddafi kept coming up. Well, look at what happened to Gaddafi. He gave up his weapons, and look what happened to him. And this is an argument I don't hear as much anymore.
Right.
But it does bring up the question of, we look back at George Kennan and what he said about containment. And we did have containment during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where, they continued to have their weapons, watch carefully, and we seem to survive pretty well in that. Do you see the situation with North Korea? Do you see containment as possibly a viable option, or is it just you cannot compare the Soviet Union with North Korea? Thanks.
And we're going to collect one other question and have Ambassador Stephens respond.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm an undergrad. My question's pretty quick, but I was just wondering what you saw the U.S. role in terms of Korean reunification and what the U.S. relationship with both North and South Korea does for reunification.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for both those questions. First, with respect to, can the U.S. live with a North Korea that retains a nuclear weapons capability? I think the answer from any American administration, including the Trump one and any other, will be no. That the U.S. is one of the foundational members, if you like, of the non-proliferation regime, which tries to enforce the notion that other countries should not be getting nuclear weapons, and in fact those who have nuclear weapons should be trying to reduce them. Now, we're not quite doing that right now, but that's what's called the NPT. It's a treaty that most countries belong to. North Korea, you know what they look at? Yeah? They look at India and Pakistan. What do you know about India and Pakistan? They both have nuclear weapons, right? They don't belong to the NPT. And when they started testing their nuclear weapons and building them, the U.S. put a lot of pressure on them, did everything it could to try to stop them, and they just endured. And so it's more the question, and I've actually heard this from North Koreans, we want to be treated like India, because actually we came around, we have an agreement with India now. India's on civilian nuclear power, so we basically acquiesced, if you like, in India having nuclear weapons. And North Korea says it should be like India. We're not going to attack anybody. It's our regional security, and we're going to keep them. I don't think any American administration is going to buy that for a whole lot of reasons. Northeast Asia is not, and actually you don't want to be South Asia, right? But this is not, and North Korea is not India. But as I said earlier, I guess my own personal view is it's going to be slow, and I think we're going to have to recognize that. It's going to take some time. And can we get greater security from a nuclear accident? Greater security from an inadvertent war, better relations, economic development. While this process goes on, yes, I think we can. And I don't mean to stretch this out for ever and ever, but I think that we have to recognize it will take some time. U.S. role in Korean reunification. To me, that's I don't want to be oversimplistic, but I think that the U.S. has we played an historical role in the division of Korea, the tragic and if you like, accidental division of Korea. I think we played an important role, and in many ways positive role, in the rise of a successful modern Korea. I think we have to be on the side of the Korean people when it comes to reunification. That we have important interests in seeing a reunification process that again is peaceful, that does not play out in a way that creates a threat to neighboring countries, but that we have to be on the side of the Korean people, but to be decided in a peaceful and democratic way. And I think certainly the expectation is that the United States would have a very good relationship with a reunified Korea. And I hope I live long enough to see it. So thank you very much.